Perfect. So, just a little bit of sort of housekeeping stuff. Try to keep yourself muted so there's no background noise. If you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat box, and I will help facilitate those questions with our speaker. That way there's not too many competing voices trying to talk over each other. For those of you who have not attended one of our lectures before, the Great Bay National Estuary and Research Reserve is part of a national system. There are 30 reserves around the country, and every reserve has 4 core programs: research, land protection, coastal training, and education. If you've been to the Great Bay Discovery Center, that's sort of the educational hub of the Great Bay National Estuary and Research Reserve. And if you've ever been to the Wells Reserve at Lodholm in Wells, Maine, they're our closest reserve. So they're one of the 30. We do these lectures each year just to try to open up free public education geared towards adults. So hopefully people can learn something new and, maybe have fun doing it too. So right now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker. Her name is Laura Brown, and she's the owner and operator of Fox Point Oysters. And she's been the owner and operator since 2011, working with small batches of oysters, kind of learning how to care for them and how to work within Little Bay and hopefully eventually Great Bay. So today she's going to talk about oyster farming in Little Bay and a little bit about the restoration efforts in Great Bay. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Laura, to share your screen. That's great. I can see it, but I don't hear you if you're talking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Right. This is on my computer. Did you want to do my phone?
The computer sounds good for now.
Okay.
Everyone, we had a little technical issues earlier, so we started a couple minutes late, but it sounds good now. So I think you can keep going with it.
Okay, perfect. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Laura Brown. I'm the owner and operator of Fox Point Oysters. I'm actually getting reverb now, so this isn't going to work. I'm going to turn off my phone audio. Can you guys still hear me?
Rose, but I can
Yes,
hear
no?
you.
Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, so a little bit about my farm. This is Fox Point Oysters. This is pretty much where I live, April through November. It is a 2-acre farm located. Hang on, I'm having super technical differ. Okay, can you hear me? I just need one person to say yes.
Can hear you. Yes. I just see your title slide. I don't know if you
Can
had
anyone hear
already
me?
forwarded.
Melissa, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Okay, yes. All right, sorry. Starting over. Sorry, everyone. Major technical difficulties on my end. Okay, so this Fox Point Oysters 2-acre farm located in Little Bay, New Hampshire. I grow the Eastern oyster and sell my products primarily directly to consumer through sales and shucking events in the local area. This was never a lifetime goal of mine by any chance. In fact, it's my second career altogether. So really briefly, my history. I grew up in Merrimack, New Hampshire, about an hour away. I came to the sea very rarely, but I always loved it when I came. After high school, I left and I studied glassblowing in the arts at Mass College of Art in Boston, where I got a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. Right after that, I headed out to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and I got a Master's of Fine Arts degree. Throughout that education, I moved around quite a bit, spent a lot of time assisting artists and working around the country. It's really hard to work in the arts, so wherever I could find a job, I would move. I finally ended up in Seattle, where I continued to make work. Everything you're seeing here is just some of my sculptures. I spent 10 years working as a glassblower, studio assistant, and really just great creative minds. I absolutely loved living out there. I ran a sculpture program at a community college for 7 years. It's exhausting. The life of the arts, I think, is even more exhausting than a life as a farmer. I seem to have it in for myself. I did enjoy working out there, but I was starting to get a little frustrated, needed some sort of change in my life. And in 2011, my sister, Kristen Ward, over on the right, and that's both of us on the left, she just called me out of the blue one day and said she had an opportunity for me to start working with Dr. Ray Grizzle at the University of New Hampshire's Jackson Estuary Lab. Together, they started restoring native oyster reefs sort of in the beginning of the 2000s, and now they've been doing it for over 20 years. In doing that, they were approached by someone who wanted to start a farm in the bay. There hadn't been any since, I think, maybe the 80s. And with a lot of disease and pollution, everybody sort of left the bay, and the oysters sort of took a major hit. So she called me up, said she could help me start my own farm. I had zero clue about any of it. Never mind oysters, forget about being in the water, nothing. I didn't even know how to drive a boat. So I said, yeah, sounds great. And in 2012, I started Fox Point Oysters, and I started out on her farm. So this was my original farm right over by Fox Point up in Little Bay. I moved back completely to New Hampshire in 2013 with my then fiance, now husband, Steve, and we completely started a new life. And I started getting really into it, learning everything I could about oyster farming, learning everything I could about the bay and the water, and went from there. And around 2015, after the boat had broken down about 100 million times, I decided I didn't want a boat anymore. And the area that I was floating over every day with my kayak to get to my place for a farm, I wouldn't even need them anymore. So in 2015, I moved over to Cedar Point, which is near the Scammell Bridge. You can see it in the background. This is a way better place for me. I didn't need the pesky boat anymore, but it also meant that I had to do a lot more manual labor and physical labor, hauling and moving oysters around without a boat crane. But it seemed to work just fine for me. For those of you who might not know the bay super well, on the left-hand side, you see the top skinny part of the bay is Little Bay. This is where all of the oyster farmers currently have farms. The lower part from Adams Point south is Great Bay, and that is a more protected area. That's where the restoration projects are currently happening. The blue dot on the top left, that indicates where my farm actually is now by the Scammell Bridge. The right-hand picture, you can see the blue dot there, and you see all the mud flats around there. Most of the farms are on unused mud flats, which is a really great thing. And I'll get a little bit more into oysters and restoration a little later, but those unused mud flats are really great places for, in fact, before we get a license through Fish and Game to have a farm in a certain space, we do have to make sure that we're not in any native eelbed areas or breeding grounds for any species. Another great part about the bay is there's 7 major rivers that flow into the bay, and that mixed with the tidal blast, which is about an 8 to 10 foot tidal flow that comes in, that all mixes together and forms the actual flavor of the oyster. So Little Bay, New Hampshire is a really nice place to raise oysters. And at high tide, this is a picture of my friend Hannah and I going out to my farm. You wouldn't even know there's a farm out there. So there's about 12 to 14 farmers right now out in Little Bay. And I think it's maybe 80 acres total that we take up. And most people who live on the bay don't even know that we exist, because at high tide, they don't see us. And right now I'm almost floating over my gear. And that's part of what I like about it. It's very quiet. The farm is very unobtrusive. We don't feed the oysters, so there really isn't a lot of input. And it's just a really beautiful, beautiful job. This is my farm at low tide. Sometimes for about an hour, twice a day. At the low tides, the cages can be exposed. Depending on the height of the low tide. Sometimes the low tide is a negative low, sometimes it's a little bit higher. So it depends on the date, but for an hour or so, they're exposed. This is great for me because I can reach them all, work on them, and do what I need to do there. But this is it. This is where I get to spend most of my day, April through usually November or December. So now I'll segue a little bit into how I actually raise the oysters. I can purchase baby oyster hatcheries or from other farms as long as they're licensed and we get the correct import permits. On the left there is tiny, I think it's 1 to 2 millimeter seed, kind of looks like quinoa. If you purchase oysters that small, you have to use an upweller to raise them to a certain size before 6 millimeter oyster, maybe a little less. That's not quite ready to head out to the farm yet, but pretty soon. So when I started buying those teeny tiny oysters, we had to have this contraption here, which is called an upweller or a flepsy. What happens is the blue barrels on the sides have a mesh bottom where the oysters sit, and a motor draws water up through the barrels past the oysters where they pump and filter the nutrients just out of the water naturally. Never feed the oysters, but they can actually double in size in just a day or two when they're really tiny like that if they're getting enough food. It's nice that you can buy oysters cheaper, but this is an unbelievably time consuming thing to do. You're really supposed to show up at least 2 times a day. If the motor shuts off during a storm, all the oysters could die. So it's a really exhausting way to raise oysters. But once they get to be about 1/4 of an inch or just under, then they're ready to go directly out onto the farm. You can also just purchase the oysters at this size and bring them out directly to the farm, which after about 5 years with the upweller, I decided this was an easier way for me and I'd rather spend my time on the farm rather than in the upweller. Their oysters are placed in these little mesh bags. The size of the mesh on the bags changes as the oysters grow, but they start out right now. This is a 9 millimeter bag. They start out anywhere from 4 to 9 millimeters. As they grow, we gently shake and scrub any of the fouling, like the algae or the sea squirts that make their home on the in-water gear. And again, as they grow, we transfer the oysters. We sort of size them into mesh size that have a large mesh, so more water passes by. We don't feed the oysters, like I said before. They eat plankton and phytoplankton that just floats by. The cages and bags also help protect the oysters from predators when they're small, like green crabs and drills. When the oysters reach a certain size, they're taken out of the bags and placed in open mesh trays or directly onto the bay floor, where they're continually raked up and sorted for harvest based on quality and size. I don't put a lot of oysters out on the ground anymore because the green crabs that are very invasive crabs, not supposed to be here, but they're not leaving anytime soon. They can just eat and eat if they're too small, like under an inch, inch and a half. I do sometimes buy large 1.5 inch oysters in the ground or wait till oysters are about 2 inches. On the ground, they're able to spread out a little more, so it's a really grow them as long as they're not getting eaten. And this is just a
Laura,
quick shot of raking gear. Really simple little rake, just a lot of shoulder strength.
hey Laura,
Sorting, yeah,
can I have you maybe try
yes.
turning off your video to see if that helps with
I
bandwidth?
can't hear you.
Oh,
Yes, yeah, yep.
let's see if that helps with the voice part of it.
Is it lagging?
It was lagging a little, yeah.
Okay. Is it just really choppy? Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, it was a little choppy. That's okay.
Okay.
It seems like maybe it's a
Um,
little better now, so we'll just keep going.
okay. So sorting the oysters. A lot of this. Okay. All right. I'll just keep going. So we're just talking about sorting the oysters. Sorting for size and transferring the oysters into the appropriate size mesh bags is pretty much what I do out there all the time. And that helps create a really pretty and healthy oyster. Are things like any kind of bag that's collecting a seaweed, it basically blocks water flow, which in turn blocks things. So we do a lot of shaking and rearranging the oyster's position within those bags so that they don't grow through the bags or they try to grow around each other. I used to do this all by hand and floating, and I recently purchased this. This is a little video. See if I can play it. Oh, no, I cannot. I purchased a machine that helps me tumble and sort the oysters. This is not going to allow me to do it here, but It's just a long cylindrical tube, and the oysters go through, they get washed off, they get beat up a little, which is not a bad thing. And then they tend to grow a deeper cup. So like sometimes when you break off the end of the shell, it's almost like filing your nails or trimming your hair. It grows deeper and thicker, and it creates a really nice, strong oyster. The ultimate goal is this pretty oyster. When you're growing food, people want to know that everything you put on a plate is beautiful. So for us, we're constantly sorting for size so that when a dozen oysters gets put, on the half shell, or you're shucking, it takes about 2.5 to 3 years for an oyster to reach an approximate 3-inch, which is the kind of the goal, about 2.5 to 3-inch harvest size in the cold waters of New England. If you go further up to Canada, it could be 4 years. Going down south, you head, towards Virginia or even Florida, it's going to take 1 to 2 years. They grow really quickly in the warmer waters. But up here, the oysters kind of take a little snooze, usually around December when the water hits around 45 until the water starts warming up again. After my first 3 years of farming, I started selling the oysters just using one wholesaler. I really did not know what I was doing. Sometimes I still don't. I reached out to some smaller grocery retail outlets, and if someone contacted me about getting oysters directly, I would sort of negotiate a time to meet them after the tide or just sell them in the parking lot. I also started selling at the farmers market in Dover, where I live. And a few years into that, I started doing events, like at weddings and things like that, just to try to see what I actually wanted my business to be and how I wanted it to run. So years later, I noticed that people were really interested in where the oysters came from. So doing a lot of the events in private and public party kind of situations was really helpful for me, and I really enjoyed it. I started down sort of this like local know your own food path, and I still continue that today. I've joined several organizations that help educate and get local food to the local markets and really teach people like where your food comes from. I think it's extremely important. Another thing I started doing was offering tours to individuals, as well as some onshore tours with people like Seacoast Eat Local, so that folks could come and learn about the oyster farms without having to go out there directly. But then if people did want that sort of in-water experience, they could do that too. 2019 sort of changed everything. It did for millions of people in the world. When COVID came, or it might have been 2020 now that I think about it, I was kind of selling everywhere: wholesale, retail, restaurants, tours, events, and everything shut down. So retail, wholesale, restaurants, those were not available anymore. So people's oysters just kept growing, and there was no place to sell them. I had a few people keep calling, asking me if I could sell direct, and I could. And so I just sat in the back of my truck with oysters and started selling them out of the parking lot by my farm. Pretty soon people would stop by and just like, what do you have? What do you got? And I'll take it. And they didn't even know how to eat an oyster or what it tasted like, or if they even liked them. But they would try them. And I feel like people were just bored. And so I started promoting it a little bit better. I started an online retail event, and somehow it worked. I started harvesting and selling exclusively directly to consumers while the whole world kind of figured out what it was going to do. I learned a ton from this. First, that selling direct requires an enormous amount of consumer support, like the email, phones, and text. That was sort of constant. And as the sole employee of Fox was super challenging. I needed to be on the farm, but I also needed to be selling. So it was a tricky way to do this. And I had to start taking any form of payment on the side of the road. The positive side was that it got me into contact with more of the consumers, and I was able to answer a ton of questions, give shucking demonstrations, could talk about recipes and cooking techniques. And I started constantly updating my website with information that I was being asked, and I was able to retail sales and grow some hype over the local oysters, which many people didn't even know existed. And I think that direct connection to the food source helped make oysters less mysterious and exclusive and more sort of accessible and part of some people's weekly diets. I suppose it sort of took some of the glamour out of getting a plate full of perfectly shucked oysters from a restaurant, for $36 or something, into this sort of fun pick up your own oysters and shuck them experience. And with COVID, I think people were looking for that outlet. This is just a photo of my neighbor's yard. He's cooked them about every way you can possibly think of, and I think that's awesome. So Fox Point Oysters now primarily sells direct to consumer during those Saturday sales. That event around New Hampshire. An example, my husband on Thursdays during harvest season can often be farm, which is a mile down the road, or at a local brewery or winery or some sort of distillery, some fresh shucked oysters, and we like going out and learning what people like. I'm going to switch sides of gears a little bit here and talk about oyster restoration for a minute. I've recently taken on sort of a new role in shellfish restoration, and so have a lot of farmers in the area. We got this opportunity. As I mentioned before, my sister on the left and Dr. Ray Grizzle here on the right have restored over 30 acres of oyster reefs in Great Bay over the last 20 years. This was sort of the initial reason I started working with the oysters, because I knew what they were doing. And then I started learning about them and how they're just really super critters. They in disease from human interaction by the end of the last century. And Kristen and Ray really created a path for restoration. And they now use the laboratory at UNH as a resource for other folks to sort of join forces, like the Nature Conservancy and Sea Grant, to help restore the native oyster reefs. And they've just recently gotten, excuse me, some of the farmers involved. Pardon me. They do this in a few different ways. One is by purchasing and deploying hundreds of cubic yards of shell onto licensed sites that were once home to really thriving native populations of oysters. The shell acts as a substrate for oysters to land and grow on. If there's not a sort of hard, cracky surface for an oyster to land on, it can just sort of slide away and die and never develop into an oyster. Once the substrate is deployed, they then place oyster shells in cages stacked in a large tank that they fill with bay water. They pour oyster larvae over the cages of shell where they attach and start to grow. This is called, once they start to grow, they call it spat on shell. Once they have the spat on the shell, cages are hung on this floating dock they created, and then they start sort of eating what the water provides, just sort of eating passively. After that, they go out to the licensed restoration sites, and they get put on top of that shell that's been deployed, where they will hopefully grow and thrive. The left is an image. You can see some of the spat on shell on top of the barnacles there. They're sort of the little darker brown spots. About 5 years ago, the Nature Conservancy approached my sister and I to see if, instead of using that floating dock to raise the oysters, if we wanted to raise some of that spat on shell on our farms, since that's what we do all the time. They thought maybe we could monitor it, we could keep an eye on it, and maybe the spat on shell would grow a little quicker than it would out on those docks where they're sort of hanging smushed together. I thought it was a great idea, and this was the sort of my first time doing part of the restoration work myself, and I found it really important and wanted to continue to use my own farm for these really helpful projects. The oyster and why it's so great and why it's so important. They are keystone species. They're filter feeders, and they eat a ton of algae, which would otherwise cause algae blooms. Algae blooms would sort of suffocate the sunlight from penetrating into the water, and other things would not be allowed to grow. They also take up nitrogen, and although nitrogen is an essential nutrient for plants and animals to grow, often too much of it can just form those algae blooms again and overwhelm the water bodies and ultimately reduce the oxygen levels in there. So oysters help take that out and change it into a different type of sediment that's a little healthier for the bay. And I often get this picture, which is sort of a YouTube classic, is do oysters really clean the water that well? And the answer is yes, they do. There's many videos you can watch that show the process just in a few hours that oysters can pump and filter and create a nice clean environment.
Laura, can I have you pause for 1 second?
Yes.
I'm gonna see if there's a way for you to increase your volume on your end, because I've increased it in Zoom. if you click the little triangle next to the microphone symbol and click audio settings.
Mhm. Hang on a second. I don't have a triangle.
Oh. On the bottom Zoom menu, that you don't have a picture of a microphone with a little triangle next to it?
No, but let me check. No. Get to audio settings though. What do you want me to do in audio settings?
Under, like kind of in the middle of mine, of mine at least, it says microphone and it says input level volume. Can you turn that up?
Yep. How's that?
Ooh,
Is that
much better. Thank you.
sure? Okay. Okay, back to it.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I just have to get back to where it was. Okay. So this was another video on my videos aren't playing right now. Shellfish. Sorry, I just lost where it was. An adult oyster, we were talking about restoration and why oysters are so great. Adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water each day. Also, nope, sorry, now completely lost track. Anyway, they're awesome. Sorry, everyone. Oysters are great. Oysters are also considered nature's little engineers, and their reefs help create sort of three-dimensional habitats that provide shelter in clear water for tons and tons of species. Natural and man-made reefs can actually add sort of like a buffer zone to help slow some incoming currents and prevent erosion. And our farm also provide all of the same services that a native oyster reef would provide. And in fact, on the farm, the cages not only protect the oysters from predators, but they act as a shelter for many of these species. Scientists at the NOAA Fisheries Milford Labs use GoPro cameras to document how the fish invertebrates might actually use the aquaculture gear. And they found something like 45 species of fish and eels that would go in and around the cages. You can see the top of the cage there at the bottom of the screen and the little the stuff that was attaching to the cages, while some of the other fish would seek shelter. And some of them uses the cage for breeding. This is a close-up of just a video shot from there. And my farm is no different. So I've encountered a variety of life on my farm: birds, squid, eggs, which was a rare one for me. Then jellyfish, big and little fish, alongside seals come over. There's lobsters, crabs, pretty much everything you can think of. Even the birds, the great blue herons, are often seen. They will head over to the top of a cage and kind of eat a crab from inside, which is fine by me. So the benefits of shellfish farming have become really well known right now. Farms and native reefs alike are creating these great habitats. And then the farms, in addition, create a healthy, sustainable food source for the local economy. So it works out really great. This, in 2019, the New Hampshire shellfish industry created the New Hampshire Shellfish Farmers Initiative to share information about the industry. And along with Sea Grant, we use Sea Grant for a lot of this. We help create sort of a one-pager to educate ourselves and other people about our industry. We are starting to have sort of similar questions, similar problems, and we all wanted to get together and create one voice so that if we needed something from our legislation, we would have it. And also, if people were curious about industry, we could sort of give them this information. We have a website. It's just nhsfi.com for New Hampshire Shellfish Farmers Initiative.com. And we have a girl that's getting a PhD at the University of New Hampshire right now, Kelsey Myers, who runs the program for it, and she does a ton of outreach. And she gets politicians right out onto our farm too to sort of teach them who we are. In this image, you'll see the yellow little shapes on the top. That is where all the farms are in Little Bay. And some of the red on the bottom, those are the farms that, or sorry, the native reefs that are being restored right now. Right around the time we had, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit here, but right around the time that we formed New Hampshire Shellfish Farmers Initiative is when COVID sort of came by. And it did change my business, as I mentioned before, to sort of direct sales. But for many people, the oysters, when they got too big, they didn't know what to do. So on the right here, you can see this gigantic oyster next to the one on the right, which is actually a normal size, like 2.5, 3-inch oyster. So people had these huge giant oysters we started calling bigs and uglies, and they had nowhere to put them. So they're just accumulating on their farm. And although it's not terrible for the water, for the bay to have those oysters in there, it was sort of mucking up their own farms and they needed something to do with them. COVID relief did not really help our industry at all because we were such a young industry. We didn't have enough data to get any help from the government. So we had to find a different way to get the oysters out there. And the Nature Conservancy and Sea Grant helped us do some projects. And the Nature Conservancy with Pew Charitable Trust helped do a project for what we called the Bigs and the Uglies. It's called the SOAR project. And it was they basically created a program where at the University of New Hampshire with their licensed restoration sites would purchase oysters directly from different states, and they would take those oysters and put them out on the reefs they were trying to restore. So New Hampshire kicked off the efforts. The press came out. This is the Today Show with Harry Smith. They came out, and it was really nice to get the attention because people came up to me like, I didn't even know there was farms in the bay, and I didn't know you guys were having any trouble. I had Dr. Jill Biden come out on the farm. Like, it just kicked off a slew of different reports and things, and that helped increase the business a long time, really well too. And my sister and I featured in New Hampshire women's magazines, highlighting the farm business and the work with restoration. So it's sort of starting to take forefront. And this is when I really got involved more heavily in restoration. So I and others in the shellfish industry have recently become more involved in growing oysters now directly for the restoration project through grants from the National Resource and Conservation Services, otherwise known as NRCS, which is part of the USDA program. So this year I partnered with Kristen and Ray and NRCS and also deployed this shell to several acres of depleted native oyster reefs by Nanny Island. I continue to raise spat on shell also on my farm for the Nature Conservancy, which we later deployed to a different restoration site down in Great Bay. This is this year, this past year, we also started a new program with NRCS. The job of NRCS is basically to help keep our waterways clean, among other things, also like farms and gardens and things like that, help extend the growing season and help people keep a clean, healthy farms. I worked with them to get a greenhouse. So on a personal level, I do a lot of gardening at my house now, and they helped fund a greenhouse for me. So out in the bay, we are basic ones that can capture that excess nitrogen from the water before it becomes overwhelming. So this year we started a program with them, and any of the farmers who wanted to could be involved. We're basically removing all this biofouling you see on the left-hand side, just hand scraping the seaweed off of those cages. And then I collected it, take it home, and was able to put it on that greenhouse and use it as extra fertilizer and nitrogen for my actual plants. So it's sort of a hallelujah. All right. There, it's Keith. There, hi. Okay, here we go. I have no words. I think I'm pretty much done here, you guys. Can you see the screen?
Yep, I can see the screen. There's cages on the left and a close-up of oysters on the right.
Well, this is just pretty much it. I was actually just wrapping it up. This
Oh,
um, just saying that the farm now is that I sort of raised this thing. Are you serious? No. Okay. I'm just gonna stop here and say that's it. We'll entertain any questions as how's that?
I do have one question. Can you hear me? Do you know if the Hampton Harbor oyster farms are utilizing the same techniques as you guys are? Nope, looks like you
Able
froze.
to all the they want. Um,
Sorry, can you start that answer
is
over
that
again, Laura?
better? Yep. There's one farm in Hampton. Yes, they are allowed to grow oysters for the restoration projects as well. And they can also do the biofouling removal also. So they can if they want to. Yeah. Yep.
Great. If you have any questions for Laura, type them into the chat box.
I think I covered everything.
I know you covered a lot. It was great. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll have to listen to the recording and see how it came out. Hopefully it came out okay.
We're terrible. It's that day. I'm sorry, everyone.
That's okay. That's okay. All right, one last call for questions. All right, I guess that's it. Let's
Great.
see. Yep, I guess that's it. So thank you so much, Laura. This was fascinating. Good to see all the work that's getting done. And hopefully it'll keep spreading throughout Great Bay, the restoration. And hopefully I'll get this up on YouTube if the audio is pretty good. And if the audio is not good, I can make a transcript. So that should help too. All right. I
Okay,
think
I wanted to just, I saw, can you hear me for a sec? Can you hear me?
yep. Yep.
Yeah, there's somebody just asked if sometimes they find live oysters on the shore in Newington, and how does that happen? And just to answer quickly, oysters will spawn every year, regardless of whether they're on a native reef or in our farms. So they have their babies and they float away. And they have to land on a hard surface, like I mentioned, in order to continue growing. So it could just be possible that wherever that place in Newington was, the oysters floated all that way and just landed there. And so it's not unheard of that they go and form different reefs in different places. So thanks for the question. Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a great day,
All right.
everyone.